part of understanding a two-party system is understanding how coalitions within the two-party system can change over time. We call those changes realignments, when large groups of voters change their party identification based on new interests that have emerged, maybe a new issue or crisis emerges, and voters become interested in different kinds of questions. There haven't been very many realignments in our country's history, and the ones that are underlined down there, those are the ones I'm going to talk about briefly, and I'd like for you to be familiar with. And I'm going to talk about this using electoral college maps. These are the maps for the presidency, and the story that I'm going to tell is then at the national level, and I'm dealing with the presidential election. It would look a little bit different if I were to talk about it from the standpoint of the House or the Senate, but not very different. And the other thing is that mostly when we're talking about political parties and the functioning of the political parties, we're focusing on the legislative branch. And so I'm going to talk about the presidency just as a way to show you the issues that the parties themselves have addressed. Now, the first thing to point out also is that in your textbook there is this little chart here that talks about each of the party systems, what the parties were, and what the most important issues were during that party system. And you can see that the issues change over time. And as the issues change, so do the groups of voters that are interested in those issues, and the way that those voters are organized and divided changes as well. Now the first party system, let's look at the first maps here. These are the first two presidential elections when George Washington was pretty much unanimously selected by the Electoral College. And at the end of his second term, George Washington delivered what we call now his farewell address to the nation, very famous speech. And he warned us about two things. He warned us not to get involved in world affairs, to avoid foreign entanglements, and he also warned us not to divide ourselves into political parties, that we should vote for the best person. But in the very next election, they very quickly divided themselves into political parties because they're just so useful. Washington didn't really understand that. The first two political parties were the Federalists and what we sometimes call the Democratic Republicans. Sometimes we call them the Jeffersonian Republicans. And these parties were really elite affairs. They were not mass mobilization parties. And one election that follows in 1820, for instance, almost the entire country votes. Almost every electoral college vote is cast for Monroe. Historians call this the era of good feelings. There's not very much division, and then the very next election in 1824 is one of the most divisive in the country's history. No one wins outright in the Electoral College, and the vote is then thrown into the House. One vote per delegate is per state delegation. And you can see here that the four people that are running, they felt like they had to put something here under party, the person writing this chart. But really, they weren't really running as a party with a party label. They were all sort of opposed to Federalist policies. So kind of looking backward, we kind of call them all Democratic Republicans. But really, they were all running as individuals. Now, John Quincy Adams ended up being made president, even though Andrew Jackson got more votes than anybody else. And if you take a look here, you can see there were about 300,000 votes cast in this election, right? Now, Andrew Jackson was pretty mad about this, that they had sort of struck a deal and he was not made president. And so he decided he was going to run again and that he was going to make sure he didn't lose. We call this period the period of Jacksonian democracy. It's worth talking a little bit about some of the innovations that Jackson brought. One of the most important things that he did is he tried to increase the electorate. He tried to bring in as many people as he could to vote for him. And he and his surrogates would go around and try and round people up and tell them that the election had been stolen from them and that they should demand their right to vote. At the beginning of the Jacksonian era, only about 40% of white males had the right to vote. The other 60% were not allowed to vote because they didn't own property. And so one of the things that he tried to do was try to get those state laws changed to enable more white males to vote. He was also trying to encourage people to identify with this new organization that he was calling the Democratic Party. Now, he ends up winning that election, and pretty handily. And when he wins, let me just show you this very quickly. And you can see when he runs and he wins in 1828, the number of votes cast is almost 1 million. So he's more than, it's more than 1 million. So he's more than tripled, almost quadrupled the numbers of people who voted. Now certainly the population was increasing, but not by that much, just in 4 years. So it was very effective in bringing people into the election. He also, when he runs again, he does some other things. He initiates the practice of having a national party convention. He also starts giving jobs to his supporters, which enables his party to begin to have more influence. And when he runs in 1828, he wins again. In 1832, he wins again. And by 1836, his vice president ran and won in that election. And by 1840, another party has emerged. You can see the purple here. This is the new party called the Whig Party. They ran in 1836 as well. And the Whig Party actually won in 1840. And the reason that they won in 1840 is because they were doing all the same things that that the Democrats were doing. That is, to reach out to as many people as possible, to expand the electorate, mass mobilization, and all of these tactics. And let me just show you what happens to the electorate. Now we're up to 2.3 million people, almost 2.5 million people. So again, with the other party now doing that as well, we're bringing more people out to vote. This is what political scientists refer to as the modern political party. And so you should know that the first election that the Democrats win, the modern Democratic Party wins, the first presidential election they win is in 1828. That's important to know. Now, this division between the Democrats and the Whigs is the two-party system for the next few elections. But once we get into the 1850s, another issue begins to become much more important. During this early period, the main issue of division was protective tariffs, which were good for industrialists, bad for farmers, and so they were contesting over this kind of a question. By the 1850s, though, slavery was the more important issue. And what happened actually was that the Whig Party itself could not come to a decision about what to put in their platform about slavery. And because voters were most interested in voting on the basis of the issue of slavery and what should be done about slavery, and the Whig Party didn't have anything about that in their platform, voters went somewhere else. And they ended up going to a new party called the Republican Party. And the Republican Party had in its platform the gradual elimination of slavery. The Democratic Party was the party of the slaveholders, so they were opposed to any restriction on slavery. The Republican Party ran a candidate in 1856, and they didn't win. But by 1860, the Democratic Party had actually split itself. There was another party that ran called the Northern Democratic Party, another party here, the Constitutional Union Party, and they ended up splitting the vote. So Lincoln won as the Republican Party candidate with only about 40% of the vote. So this is the second major realignment as voters began to shift to the Republican Party because the Republican Party had something meaningful to say about slavery. And you can see in this election, 1864, these are all gray because they're not part of the country at that time. They're the Confederate States of America. By 1865, the war is over, and in 1868, they're back in the Union. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that after the Civil War has ended, the South, in these two presidential elections, most of the Electoral College votes in the South are cast for the Republican candidate. Now, that should be surprising to you, the fact that the Republicans were winning in the South after the Civil War, because the Republican Party had just destroyed the way of life of white Southerners. They had burned down cities and stolen crops, and it was a situation of great animosity toward the Republicans in the South. But what's happening during this period is Reconstruction. And during the Reconstruction period, the the troops were still stationed in the South during this period, and they were protecting the right to vote for the former slaves. And they were also making sure that many Confederates, especially those who held any government office, were not allowed to vote. So there were actually African Americans elected to office during this early period. I think I mentioned that when we talked about civil rights. By 1876, though, let me just move to that election. By 1876, Northerners were getting kind of tired of the policy of Reconstruction. It was expensive, and it was also emotionally draining. The candidate that ran in 1876 for the Republican Party pledged that he would end the policy of Reconstruction if Southern states would vote for him. And so two of the states, South Carolina and Louisiana, gave him some of their Electoral College votes in exchange for this promise that he would end Reconstruction. So he did. They ended Reconstruction. And then in the next few maps, you can see what happens. When the Northern troops go back home, the white power structure reemerges, and these African Americans are no longer allowed to vote. They're restricted from voting in the various ways that we talked about when we talked about civil rights. And the Democratic Party takes over the South. And you can see how long this lasts. Let me just go through some of these maps. You can see 1884 into the 1890s, beginning of the 20th century, In all of these elections, the South is solidly Democratic. And they're Democratic because white Southerners will not vote for Republicans. They hate Republicans. It's an animosity that went on for quite a long time. And in 1928, they're almost the only part of the country that votes Democratic in that election is the South. You can see what happens here. By the way, let me just go forward a little bit and you can see how long this lasts, the solidly Democratic South. It still goes on into the 1960s. Okay? And things begin to change in 1968. But before we get here, we need to talk about what happens here. 1928, the Republicans win almost all of the Electoral College votes. And then in 1929, in December, the stock market crashes. And in the next 2 years, a depression sets in. Half the people are either underemployed or unemployed, and the stock market loses more than half its value. By the time you get to 1932, the candidate running, Roosevelt, runs on the platform of the federal government managing the economy and providing some kind of federal relief for the Great Depression, federal government relief. Now, the shift from here to here is what we call the New Deal coalition. There were lots of groups that came and ended up voting Democratic in this election that didn't vote Democratic before. And over time, they end up staying Democratic, and that's why we call this another realignment. Members of the New Deal coalition included Southern whites who were already Democratic. And FDR worked very hard his entire presidency not to do anything that would alienate the white South, because they were the most loyal voting bloc for his party. They also brought in urban machine politicians, those who were practicing Jackson's patronage system. Another group that came into the Democratic Party for the first time were Northern African Americans. We talked about the Great Migration already. Many African Americans had moved north, and when they moved north, they were able to vote. And they were voting Republican for the same reason that white Southerners were voting Democratic. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And so to convince them to vote Democratic in this election for economic reasons, that was a big deal. Progressives were also brought into the Democratic Party at this time. Progressives had been Republicans. They had tried to strike out on their own with a progressive party. But Teddy Roosevelt himself led up those efforts. And these are people who were interested in things like democratic reform, urban reform, public safety and health. So progressives started voting Democratic. Also industrial workers. Now some industrial workers had been Democratic. Some of the ones who were brought in through the machine politics, patronage. But some of them were Republican also, because they had been voting Republican because the Republican Party had been passing and supporting tariffs that were beneficial to industry. And farmers were also part of the New Deal coalition, and they had already been Democratic. Now, by the time you get to the late 1940s, the economy had begun to improve, and so economic issues were not the most motivating for voters. They started looking for other kinds of issues, or candidates started looking for other kinds of issues to attract voters to their candidacy. And one of the issues that Northern Democrats began to pick up is the issue of civil rights. Now, part of the reason that they do that is because after this New Deal period, now they have as their voters, Democrats do, they have as their voters African Americans and also progressives, and both of those groups would be interested in civil rights legislation. And so it begins to be there begins to be an electoral payoff for supporting those policies. And so Northern Democrats begin to do that. Now, when Northern Democrats begin to support civil rights, Southern Democrats become confused and start to look elsewhere. In 1948, there was a third party called the States' Rights Party. Strom Thurmond was the candidate. And they were running on a platform pretty much of allowing the South not to do civil rights if they didn't want to. He won some electoral college votes in the South. Now, when you get into the 1960s, the issue pops up again. The South votes Democratic in 1960. It's Kennedy. After Kennedy's assassinated, Johnson takes over. And as president, Johnson was instrumental, along with Martin Luther King Jr. and some other civil rights leaders, in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And when the presidential election is held in 1964, the South punishes Johnson. He himself was a Southerner from Texas. And it's the first time that you see a large bloc of the South vote Republican since the Civil War. So it's been almost 100 years that the South has been solidly Democratic. In 1968, they try something different, which is a party called the American Independent Party. George Wallace is heading that up. And again, it's another kind of anti-civil rights party. In 1972, though, they don't really have to look for they don't really have to support this political party anymore, because the Republican Party, when it is noticing this dissension that's coming from the South, and so they begin to search around for other issues that they can use to attract Southern whites to the Republican Party. And a set of issues that they hit upon are issues of civil rights and also social conservatism. And social conservatism issues like women's role in society, being opposed to abortion, and gay rights are starting to become an issue, not so much yet. But the role of religion in society has become an issue with some Supreme Court cases about the separation of church and state. And so this is coinciding with a move in the evangelical Christian churches where preachers are starting to say that they need to become more involved in politics. The Republican Party then starts to put these issues in their platform, and when they do that, they attract the South to the Republican Party. In 1976, it's the last time you see a solidly Democratic South, and the candidate is Carter, who is from the South. He's from Georgia. He gets elected, and then it turns out he's a flaming liberal. And so by 1980, they abandon him. And Georgia, his own state, is the only state that votes for him. But this is when the real pattern of the South being Republican is established. And you can see in the last few elections, the South now is considered solidly Republican. And so this is one of the important shifts in this last six-party system, this new coalition based on issues of traditional values. So if you remember, we talked earlier about the Gallup chart, or the division between the role of government and traditional values, where Republicans are the ones wanting to say that government is doing too much, it should be left to individuals and businesses, and the Democrats are wanting to say the government should do more. The 1930s is when this division emerges between the two political parties. This division here over whether government should support traditional values or government shouldn't favor any particular set of values, that division emerges in the 1960s and 70s. And so we still see these 2 points of division between the two political parties in terms of the coalitions and policies they support. The other important thing about the recent coalition is the shift of the Southern whites to the Republican Party. Now, the shift takes a long time. I've talked about it from the standpoint of national politics. And it appears first on a national level, but it takes a long time to move down to the state and local level. Because organizations are pretty stubborn things. I would just remind you, a couple years ago when gay marriage was made legal by the Supreme Court, I don't know if you remember, there was a clerk named Kim Davis who was refusing to give these marriage licenses, and it became a huge national issue. People started thinking about her and asking her questions, and turned out she was a Democrat. And people started saying, why is she a Democrat? Well, she was a Democrat because the Democratic Party where she lived was extremely conservative, and it was serving her well. It served the interests of conservative whites in the area. And there was no particular reason for her to vote any other way. She was probably somebody who voted Democratic at the local level, but then Republican on the national level. Now, after people focused attention on her, she did actually change her party affiliation to be Republican. But it does take a while for this sorting to happen at the local level. So, for instance, 2012 is the first year when all the state-level Democrats in the South are actually liberal, as opposed to conservative. So it took it was in the 1950s that started happening at the national level. It wasn't until 2012 that it was completed at the state level. And you'll still find in many places at the local level the Democratic Party being very conservative, almost Republican.